Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the US population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hi, I'm Scott Osborne, and you're with A Woman's Place with Scott and Ashley. Hi, Ashley Brown. How are you today?
Hi, Scott Osborne. I'm good. And I cannot help but say this because you and I had the same thought today. And thank you for verbalizing it.
What was
That
that?
when we talked about the podcast, it seemed more like talking and not visual. And it's like, oh, crap.
Oh my, yes. Podcast should be audio. So all of our audience are actually watching. Thank you. We did not anticipate that we'd actually have to put on our game faces. We thought we could just talk until
It
we were
is.
informed that we actually had to be photographed as well, which changed the whole thing. But here we are.
Here we are. Here
Happy
we are.
Thursday.
And
And
so
today
much
we're
to talk
talking
about.
about DEI. Much in the news. Where do we start with this one?
We are. And so this is our second episode. So bear with us as we work through some of our kinks of me talking over Scott mainly. But after our first episode that I thought was great, I had the thought, and when I connected with Scott, she had the same thought of like, there's a lot in the news about DEI, and maybe we need to dig deeper on do people even know what DEI is or where's the history of it? So there we go.
Right, because we wanted to talk about the care economy. That was looming large to us, but there's just been too much happening in the past 2 weeks on DEI and DEI related, and it's spinning off that seemed like we had to just deal with that one right away. We may come back to it, but we have to at least start dealing with it.
Oh, we're definitely coming back to the care economy because that is
And we'll come back to DEI too, I expect.
probably time and time again.
Yep.
Yeah, so let's dig in.
Can I start with what's happened in the last 2 weeks, or do you want to say something else? Just the big picture?
I think we need to talk about the big picture because before we can get into the what's happened in the last couple of weeks, and this really started around my dinner table when someone said, I don't even know that I understand what DEI means. So it was an aha moment for me of maybe we break it down in the big picture. What were the origins of it? How has it evolved and where we are? So if you would indulge that question.
We'll get started. So it is interesting. Where did this DEI come from? And depending on the generation of people, I think there are a lot more people who know affirmative action, which of course is its close cousin, you might say, but what's amazing is it started really before a lot of people were born in the early 60s. I mean, these first executive orders and then legislation were under Kennedy and Johnson for affirmative action. And that's when we first started having legal changes. And it's probably worth saying that before that, you could effectively legally discriminate against a Black person. No Blacks hired, no Blacks wanted. A woman who got pregnant could be fired. You could not hire women for positions. And there were few to no legal or any other repercussions. So we had a world where that kind of discrimination by race or gender was the norm almost. So we had these very segregated workplaces, not only up and down in terms of management, but across the board. So it was predominantly white male in so many positions of value. So 64, the first executive orders from Johnson, Civil Rights Amendment.
1964.
1964. So what are we doing the math? 60 some years ago. This is not a new thing. This is before so many people today were even born. This is something we've gotten used to. And first, it really started on legal discrimination. You could not discriminate legally. But then, of course, as often happens, it changes social and cultural mores and understandings and workplace environments. So it really grew from there through into the 21st century, much greater awareness of some of the cultural issues in workplaces, greater awareness about sexual orientation, so that those people could not be discriminated against. People who were out with their sexual orientation, if they were homosexual, that was acceptable. It did not used to be acceptable. People were seriously closeted or would risk being fired, for example. Certainly then, just much more recently, to speed up, after the murder of George Floyd, which was a 2020 now, there was just a huge awareness of, or great awareness of racial issues. It was just so much loomed large, and many corporations really doubled down on some of their efforts. But then I would say it started backtracking very quickly. This did not just happen in 2025. In 2023, not to get too wonky, the Supreme Court decision basically said that affirmative action was a form of discrimination, and it really outlawed a lot of affirmative action in colleges. That was a case for universities, colleges, that they could not use racial preferences to select their student bodies. The claim at the time was that essentially too many Asian students were being admitted. So people claimed that using race balancing was discrimination. So that was called, the Supreme Court decision was Fair Admissions versus Harvard. But companies really began stepping back in 21, 22. Before that, they would often have a DEI officer, a DEI office, which might engage in training, might track data, are people advancing? What are the demographics of people advancing? All of those kind of things. So now, of course, we're in a very different, both legal and cultural moment in the beginning of 2025, and we can talk about that. But it might be worth saying what DEI actually stands for too, before we just keep throwing it out.
Yeah, no, let's do that. And then I want to ask a question going back to maybe late 70s, 80s and affirmative action. So, but to your point, DEI is...
So diversity is the notion that we are a diverse nation. I mean, that's a fact. That's not a notion. That's a fact. We're a diverse nation. And then embracing and accepting that diversity is something desirable for us as a nation, in our schools, in our government offices, in our workplaces, that's who we are, and that we don't want to prejudice or discriminate against people in all of their diversity. That's just that concept, which in many ways very much reflects America as a nation of immigrants and diverse people. Equity is basically giving people equal opportunities, the notion that we want to be equitable and fair in opportunities. And inclusion is a deeper cultural notion that we want people to feel comfortable being who they are. For example, if you come from, a background that is not the norm, let's just say in your place of work. If your place of work is overwhelmingly male and white, for example, and you're a Black female, you have a whole bunch of different perspectives on things potentially. You may have had a different upbringing. We want people, with whoever they are, to feel safe and included. So that's a little more of a subtler social and cultural notion, but all three of them work together, and all three of them work to either give people equal opportunity or not, as the case may be.
So, and when you break it down just in the words, why would anyone disagree with that?
Oh, we could talk about that. There is opposition.
Well, which kind of goes,
is opposition.
I think that when we talk about the 60s, when truly, and I think younger women today, the idea that you could lose your job because you chose to start a family would be like,
or sometimes even get married. Sometimes even get married. That would then be seen as presumably you would be starting a family. You'd be less interested in employment. You might not be promoted. You might lose your job. Correct.
Right. Another thing that was a real thing, and I have two instances within my family unit of mother-in-law who was a teacher and was paid differently because she was not the breadwinner of the family. And so, I mean, and that was okay. It was just like, well, you are married, so your husband's the breadwinner, so you can make less. So, Mr. Smith, who is the breadwinner, can make more. And it was just like...
But you still see that, Ashley. This is a small digression, but the data still bears that out. It's called the marriage benefit for men and penalty for women, that men, even otherwise equally qualified, once they're married, they will often see, again, this is aggregate data, a salary bump, and women a salary decline, with that very same cultural notion that a
Still
male is a
exists.
breadwinner and needs more. Yeah.
So, but and I digress into the just trying to put it in perspective for some of our younger listeners is that there was a time no blacks hired, and so the need for affirmative action and putting legal structure around protection was real. And then it feels like the narrative shifted in maybe 70s 80s that you took my job because you were a woman, or because you took my space. So it wasn't, I think that shift of there were lots of factors and reasons why manufacturing decreased in the US, but being able to pin it on things like this and to make somebody the enemy seemed to become part of the narrative. Is that too deep? Is that too deep?
No, it's an
on our-
interesting point because, I mean, many things shifted our economy. Of course, all
Mhm.
kinds of things in the global economy shifted. For example, the availability of manufacturing and so-called factory work, which at one time was very solid employment, overwhelmingly male, and a lot of that declined. That had nothing to do with women or immigrants or brown people moving into the
Mhm.
workplace. It had to do with the global economy and many other factors. But you also had to remember, beginning in the 70s, that women really started to flood colleges after Title IX. And that was decreed that people had to have universities and educational institutions had to afford opportunities equally, not only in sports, but in everything. So women started to get college degrees in numbers that had not previously been seen. So suddenly they were moving into different marketplaces. But at some point, I want to talk about the evidence of what the bias we've seen is. But you're right. In the 70s and 80s, I think when the economy is good, people don't look for scapegoats as much. When the economy is not as good, people look for scapegoats. That's probably a
No.
common thread.
So, and I think that my purpose in even bringing that up is to just sometimes, and you hit the nail on the head with the word scapegoat. Like, let's make somebody at fault for this, in the fact that it's something that in theory is a really positive thing. Let's make this something that we should be against and to see as
Right,
a
and
threat.
it can be used for political purposes. You know, many major corporations in America who have their finger on the pulse of the country, they know that not only their consumers and customers are phenomenally diverse, but they need a diverse workplace to be the best they can be, to bring different ideas to the table. And there's lots of studies that show more diverse workplaces and more diverse boards tend to perform better on the stock market, for example, simply because you've got more ideas kicking around. People have different perspectives, especially companies that produce goods or services that people are buying. The consumers and the customers are very diverse. You know, the more voices and perspectives you have creating these things and working there, you know, there are very concrete benefits for business. So again, businesses vary, but you know, many of them realize that this is in their own, you know, dollar stock market's price interest. Even if, let's just say, they didn't like it for social or moral or justice purposes, many of them know that this is in fact good business practice, and that continues to be good business practice. So, which is why it's going to be interesting to see what many corporations do now.
And before, and we're going to get into what's happened in the last week, really 2 weeks, which is a lot. But I think you talked about that progression starting in the 60s and then in 2020 with George Floyd, and more of the racial biases really becoming more illuminated, I think, and focused on, okay, what really is happening. And then that pendulum swing to the other side, which is, I feel like we are now.
There's cycles. I mean, I'm a student of history somewhat, and there are definitely cycles. And we're seeing that for a lot of reasons. There's no question. I just want to go back to the idea that, the kind of anecdote, I lost my job or I didn't get my job because a person of color got it or a woman got it. And the implication is that they are less qualified. Just by saying that, the implication is that the person saying that, if it's a white male, is more deserving of it. And one reason, in fact, that, again, I'm going to use white men because that's the group that previously had a privileged position on these jobs. For one thing, their share of the population has just declined in terms of numbers. We have a lot more immigrants of color. So the percent of the population that is white male is not what it was 60 years ago. So even if you look around the room, and that's no one's discrimination, that's just who we are as a pool. So they might look around and see fewer people who are white male. The other thing, as I mentioned, women have started going into higher education, and certainly in the last 20, and especially the last 10 and 15 years, in numbers far exceeding what men are doing. So if their qualifications and their ability to get hired for some positions requiring college degrees is technically outstripping men. And that's not because men are not being hired, it's because they're not selecting to go on to college for a variety of reasons or finish. And that could be a whole interesting topic. I don't think it's a good thread. We need lots more people educated. It's not better. It's an issue, but therefore that is a factor so that people do see workplaces that might look different, but in part because women are choosing higher education at greater rates and finishing at greater rates in many demographics than today. So that's an interesting factor.
Well, and I just want to underline what you just said. The reality is there's been a diversification in the diversity of our workforce. White men,
who we are as a country.
Right, as we are as a country. So, even if you had 100 people lined up who were applying for a job in 2025 versus 1950, it looks very different. So,
and the interesting, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was done. No.
One of the ways that people don't know how they study some of this thing, they study hiring. You can see promotions because that information is more readily available. So if you have, let's just say, a diverse workforce that gets hired, you will see who is promoted and who moves up. As we know, CEOs are still overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white male in our country. I was a little bit gobsmacked that just recently there was a study, this was 2022, that found that of 681 companies, this is from Fortune 500 and S&P 500, the CEO, Chief Executive Officer, COO, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Financial Officer, 88.8% were white and 88.1% were male. 2022 data, 681 companies. So that's again, those are cherry picking a couple of roles, but that says something about who's rising up. What I got a huge kick out of was the headline was diversity continues to rise. So clearly, right? But
I'm sorry.
There's no indication of bias promoting or hiring white men. There is none. People study this all the time. They do blind resumes. If you don't know how they do hiring, they do blind resumes, but they put different names because that's often an indicator. If you put names that sound distinctively Black or ethnic, female sounding names that sound like what people assume are a white male, and they look at callbacks and they look at hiring. Same qualifications, same credentials, same schools, etc. They do these, and that's how they can pick up perceived implicit biases. Again, it isn't I should say it isn't necessarily active. I do not by any means want to say people are necessarily sitting in human resources desks and actively saying, we don't want any more women, okay? But often it's an implicit bias, and people don't realize that, and I give people a great deal of empathy. We all have products of this culture. I'm a white woman. I have implicit biases. I do my best to be aware of them, but I'm a product of this culture. We all are. So a lot of it could be implicit biases, and that works its way up. And then we see who gets promoted and up to management. And by the time you get to CEO and COO, it's overwhelmingly white male, even if a more diverse pool might get hired.
And then it becomes episode 3, the care economy, and where it plays in for women in particular. And then who had the opportunity to get the education, to get the training, to even be in line for. And I would also say, just as I would agree, I would hope, and I do feel like there's not people saying, I'm not going to hire more women or more Hispanics. Conversely, I don't think there's people saying, oh, we only have 3 women. We need to get 5 women. So, I think that notion that's like we need so many in each demographic is
Well, I want to be 100% honest and factual. There have been overstepping. We're a big country. There have been overstepping, I would say, in both ways. So
okay.
sometimes there is evidence of organizations saying we need more women. Okay. So obviously, these are things that are progressive. People have to figure out what to do about that. How do we reverse historical biases? That's a
Mhm.
very real issue. How do you make corrections for historical biases? On the other side, there are people, including someone who was just moved into the State Department, Darren Beattie, who is on record as saying competent white men must be in charge. So, there's a lot of people involved in this. I would not say that none of them have run afoul of excesses. I think we have to be fair and say there are undoubtedly some excesses. I personally don't think that eviscerates the basic notion that we want diverse, equitable, inclusive workspaces, federal offices, schools. But have there been excesses on both sides? Undoubtedly. It would be impossible to say, and we have evidence of some. So I think that's important to say. I don't think that changes, there's a lot of people involved here. I don't think that changes the fundamental value of the principle.
No, okay, and that's fair. And I think about at the center that when we saw an expanding client base of Hispanic women, we needed to really look at our staff to see, did we have the capacity to serve? And we didn't. So we needed to expand specifically in that demographic, language wise, and cultural comfort, I guess, or ease of people. So no, I could see that, and I can see the excess, and that's a good call out. That's a fair call out.
And some of it is very cultural. For example, there's a preference. Retail establishments tend to prefer women. Automotive parts supplies dealers tend to prefer men. You see that consistently in these blind hiring patterns. So, we have some residual things like that. I do think it's unfortunate that we now have somebody in the administration saying publicly competent white men should be in charge. I think, white men are 30% of the population. There's a lot of people who do not fit that category who would be very qualified.
Can you give me that stat one more time? How many? 30%?
White men are about 30% of our current population. Correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's not enough. Yeah. That's not enough. Okay, so has anything been happening on the DEI? Has anything happened on the DEI front?
For anybody who has not been under a rock, then so in the last, it's 2 weeks now, we've had, I guess I want to say 3 executive orders and then a number of companion pieces essentially banning all of this. The first one was ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity, which essentially eliminated support for mention of gender equality, DEI policies, et cetera, diversity, equity, any kind of equitable decision making. There was a laundry list of terms that were now forbidden. Even the language of the executive orders is interesting. One of them is ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing. Eliminates all DEI offices, and all federal agencies have instantly terminated those, et cetera. There was a third one basically called defending women from gender ideology extremism. We should probably come back to that separately. But there have been 3 executive orders which have just rocked federal agencies, federal contractors, as well as the private sector, because Attorney General Pam Bondi, as well as state attorney generals, have said they will go after private corporations who continue to engage in what is now considered suspect DEI initiatives. So it's extended beyond just government offices.
What do we mean? I wonder what they mean by go after. Criminal?
Well, yeah, I don't know exactly what the action, I don't have it in front of me what the action was, but they would take them to court is the implication. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm claiming discrimination. Yeah, equal opportunity clause, I assume. So so what we're seeing, just to fast forward, so we're seeing especially, I mean, the federal government now, there's a scrubbing of, not only the offices, obviously, which have been eliminated, but I think a little even more scary for the long term is there's scrubbing of all kinds of data now. Anything that seems to disaggregate by gender, including scientific data, anything in the CDC that refers to reproduction, et cetera, that's all coming off of public websites. So there's been a huge loss of data that the federal government was always the guardian of, because it is now triggering elimination because the gender disaggregates in some way. So even regardless of what you might think of DEI and how those hiring works, I think the notion that we are now making this data either we're not collecting or is not available to the public because it may have to deal with women, may have to deal with sexual orientation, et cetera, is very challenging. If we don't track data on these things, it's very hard to know what's happening. So I think that's just one of many side effects.
Well, and that is data in that piece is something that the general conversation's not even gonna think about, because the focus and where you can get people all riled up is that focusing on the emotional aspects of it. Like, are you discriminating? Did you take my job? Is it merit based? If you're not white and male, you're not qualified. But, some of the long-term implications of not only reporting that data, but tracking it to understand, like, what would that be?
The tracking the data is going to be critical. I mean, a lot of it too is just purely scientific. It's medical information, which now we're at risk of losing. And, in many, many fields, it's only been pretty recently that data on women was tracked, even things like engineering. I mean, you probably have heard the stories about how the design of automobiles and how a airbag hits you was designed for a male of a certain proportion, and that was always considered to be the default. In many engineering models with humans, it was always a male, and it disproportionately disadvantaged women, you might say, who were not included in this. There have been studies of drug studies until very recently never included women. It just men were always the default. In recent years, there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of excellent work done to include women in studies and research and design, because they're half the population. Again, this isn't a question of preference. This is a question of just let's including how they live, how they function, what the size of their bodies are, And there's a lot of concern that now that will start to be lost because this is such a broad brush of anything that includes considering gender is what it appears. And so there's a lot of concern that that will be lost. I mean, in addition to hiring implications. So that's a data implication, really. You know what we didn't talk about, though? We didn't talk at all about why, maybe we don't have time today, why people fear diversity. And I think that's a very interesting one. So Ashley, I don't know if we want to come back to it, but I always try to understand why, because I think we need to understand why if we want to sort this out, make it work for all of us. So that's a topic right there we could come back to maybe.
Gino, is Care Economy going to podcast 4? Is it? There is, the other thing that we didn't get into, and it kind of goes to what you were talking about with like the automotive industry and design, is we had a really fascinating conversation. Again, something that hadn't occurred to me of the implicit bias of AI and technology. Right.
And that's a huge one. As our lives are basically governed by algorithms, whether we like it or not. And those are overwhelmingly written by men. I think women are 5-10% of coders these days. There's been a push to get them in there more, but algorithms are not gender, ethnic, race neutral. They embody all the implicit biases that their creators come to the table with. And there's a great deal of concern as those algorithms rule our lives more and more, as AI expands, that those will just be encoded and deepened and perpetuated if we don't have, and there's been a big push to get women into those positions, but it's very, very slow. And that's
So
a problem.
the push to get women into those positions would now be considered inappropriate, right? That we couldn't. So I think that's one of the questions is we're scrubbing the language and people, are we going to be able to promote, hey, we see we need to expand to have more women or more, fill in the blank.
We need to reflect America. We need to reflect
Right.
America. Yeah.
I think that's
That
a good
that's
thing.
absolutely the concern. And I guess before we end, I mean, I really do look at and work hard to understand why people are worried about these. We all believe in equity and justice, and none of us
Mhm.
like to think that someone was hired or promoted for reasons that don't reflect merit. But the nuances of how to accomplish that are where where the devil in the details are. And that's what needs to be dealt with. But America is phenomenally diverse. It's not getting
Mhm.
any less so. And I think recognize that is very important.
I would even argue it's getting more so.
Yes, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I do think that our next program that we need to dig into what are people afraid of and why are they so
Oh yeah, that'd
afraid
be a good
of?
one.
And
That's
I
worth thinking
think
about.
and I think that America continuing to become more diverse is kind of at the foundation of some of that fear.
Yeah, yeah, it
I
is.
think for sure. Okay, so before how are we how are we at our time? It goes
It
so
is.
quickly.
It is.
So
We
do
have
we
many
have
things
any
to do.
takeaways that we want to leave people with on this other than I guess that now that we're out in the podcast verse, if people want to send questions in, can they do that? We didn't talk
Absolutely.
about that. Why not?
Absolutely. We didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about that. So we have our email in the show notes. And so people
Hmm.
can send us an email for future shows or questions or comments.
Yeah, that would be interesting, right?
Yes.
I think so. Um, as always, I leave our conversations more informed and calmer. You talk about things in such a manner that it is just straightforward and easy, and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Ash. I think we should do another show on this because there's more to get into that people could learn, but we'll figure out the next show right after this.
Well, and the joy of our partnership is that Scott is like, wait a minute, Ashley has taken us down a rabbit hole of a question. So, but that is the joy of a woman's place with Scott and Ashley, right?
Thank you.
I know.
Lovely seeing you. Till next
All
time.
right, good to see you. Take care.